Hello, this is Tony Blazer back with another video for the Motocross Vault here on YouTube. For this one, what I'm going to do is another one of my classic magazine reviews. This one is going to be for the 1988 October issue of Super Motocross, a magazine I loved. Super Motocross was published by Petersen Publishing, the same company that did Dirt Rider. Featured photographs from great industry icons like Fran Kuhn, who would go on to do Inside Motocross. Had some great photography, really innovative storytelling, and a lot of great articles. I really love this magazine. Unfortunately, it didn't last very long. Inside Motocross, I'm sorry, Super Motocross went from about 1987 till I believe 1989. I have every issue over here, and I'm pretty sure it only lasted those 2 years. Not sure why. After it went under, Dirt Rider kind of folded that whole little subsection into a part of the magazine called Moto that focused more on motocross and supercross as opposed to the overall off-road community. Great magazine, didn't last really long, but definitely worth a look back. So like I said, for this issue we're going to go through the 1988 issue page by page, just like I did on the previous one, which I'll include a link to at the end here if you haven't seen that one. The other one we did was a Motocross Action from 1989. I got a lot of good feedback on that one, so we'll do a few more. If you like this, make sure you subscribe and hit that little bell to make sure you get updates when we publish new installments. And here we go. Alright, on the cover here we have, I believe, Willie Simmons. It doesn't say. Usually in the table of contents it'll tell you who it is, but I'm pretty sure this is Willie. He was a guy who did a lot of the tests for Dirt Rider and a lot of their photo shoots back then. On the new 89 YZ. This issue covers the 89 bikes a little bit. I always love, like I said, the new model releases, and the magazines that covered them were always great. This one also has a great look at RJ's Factory Racer, which I loved that article as well. Had the picture on my wall. So we'll get into the issue. One thing I do want to mention is I got a little bit of a cold, so if I sound a little stuffed up, I'm sorry, but we're powering through in spite of the being under the weather here. Alright, first up on the inside cover here, we have an ad for Axo Sports' new 135 pants and Type S jersey. This was some really good looking stuff. This is when Axo Sport really started to hit their stride. They had been started in the U.S. in 1984 by Jim Hale when he came over from O'Neill Racing. And they had started off, really just as a boot company more or less. But Jim had the idea to move into a little more kind of a broad gear range. And they had Yoko Sport kind of build this stuff for them, and this was some really good looking stuff. The pants had kind of a sheeny look, the twill fabric. It was called Hydronil 520, whatever that is, but it had a really cool shimmery look to it, very unique. That kind of look was big in the late 80s. Thor came out with some stuff that was fairly similar, but this was a good looking gear. Definitely some of my favorite gear of the late 80s here. Axo Sport was really, like I said, kind of coming on strong at this point, and just about to supplant JT Racing as like probably the top competitor to Fox here in the gear wars. Alright, on pages 4 and 5 we have an ad for Ford's trucks and their championship winning machines of 1987. Ford definitely has got a long running history of being successful in racing, and their Ford trucks are certainly no exception. I'm not really into truck racing or car racing, and really for that matter. I've always been more of a two-wheeled fan, so I really didn't follow any of this stuff. My closest experience would be playing the Ivan Stewart game for the Genesis back in the day. So I don't really know any of the people in this ad, but good for Ford. I'm glad they had a great year that year. All right, here on the table of contents page, we have a photo of Rick Johnson from the 1988 LA Coliseum race, kind of jumping up the peristyles. Personally, I would much rather have a normal photograph here. They took a very artistic look to it. It's interesting. I guess a little different, but I'd rather have like a nice normal photograph personally. If you look at the staff here on the left, there's a lot of people who were pretty big in the motocross industry and the magazine side of things in the late 80s. Guys like Charlie Morey, Bob Carpenter, Joe Bonello, Fran Kuhn, big names. So there's a lot of smart people behind Super Motocross. Like I said, I'm not sure why it didn't take off. Maybe there's just too many at the time. You had, Dirt Rider, Dirt Bike, Motocross Action. You didn't really have Inside Motocross was still a couple years away, so maybe there was just too much going on there. Motocross had already failed, so I don't know. Maybe there just wasn't enough room in the field for another motocross mag. But Super Motocross was a great magazine. It's kind of a bummer that it didn't last longer than it did. On page 8 here, we have an editorial by Bob Carpenter, and it kind of goes with the theme of this issue, which is a lot about America versus the European racing at the time. This is something that still plays out today, with guys like Jeffrey Hurlings and Antonio Caroli, and our string of getting our butt kicked in the Motocross des Nations the last few years. There's always been this kind of a interplay between America and Europe in terms of who is best. In the late 80s, America was on quite a run there. They've been dominating since the early 80s with after winning the 81 Motocross des Nations. We went on a run there and won I think 13 in a row if I remember right. But even at this point, they were already talking about America kind of becoming a little more in parity with Europe again, with some fresh blood like guys like Jean-Michel Bayle and some of the new guys coming up who no longer were, emulating the riding styles of guys like, Kees van der Ven and some of these old school riders. They were looking to the Americans like Rick Johnson and Jeff Ward as inspiration. It's pretty clear that while that didn't happen overnight, the Europeans were going to school on us. You see guys like David Villeman coming over, Greg Albertine, even Grant Langston coming over in the late 90s and early 2000s. And now I'd say we're on parity or even maybe a little bit behind, certainly in terms of motocross. So this issue deals a lot with that, and that although they may be a little ahead of the curve here, saying the Europeans are really making a comeback at this point, I think it has come to fruition now. On the right, we have an ad here for Coors. Coors was one of the sponsors of Supercross at the time, along with Camel. Some of the other, actually, this might have been before Camel. Camel may have come along like a year or two after this. Nowadays, you wouldn't see this so much with all the issues with advertising, where you're not allowed to have cigarette ads and beer ads and a sport geared towards kids. But I would probably say that things like energy drinks aren't a whole lot better for you, maybe even worse than something like Coors. But that being said, Coors was a major sponsor in the sport in the 80s, and you see some of the early late 80s, early 90s motorcycles definitely had Coors sticker on them. That's one of the cool things about this era for sure. Alright, starting on page 10, we got our first look at some new machines for 1989. First up in this issue is the Yamaha lineup. Within the YZs, the biggest news was the all-new YZ125. I actually had an 88 YZ125 and an 89 YZ125, and there was a pretty significant difference this year. The 89 125 was all new, had a new frame, new bodywork. It got the YZM look bodywork of the 88 250. They also added a upside down fork, which was all new for 89. This was the first year for the inverted forks on the YZs, and a 19-inch wheel. Big difference. Came with a very unique kind of they called it a tractor tire. It looked like almost like a mud tire on an ATV. It's kind of a strange design Bridgestone that year. This bike was, like I said, all new. The engine was probably the only thing that wasn't majorly revised. It ran very similarly to the 88. Still was kind of a low to mid engine. Didn't have a ton of top end power, but the ergonomics and stuff were way improved. Handling was much better. The new frame, new fork gave it a stiffer feel. Turning was improved as well. The 250 got the inverted fork and the 19-inch rear wheel as well. The body work was the same. Like I said, that was all new in 88. Wasn't a real big difference. There were just some. The main difference was the suspension. They did a few things to the motor and kind of tried to tighten up the handling slightly, but it wasn't as big of a difference as the 125 was that year. The YZ80 and 490 were still in the lineup, but they were completely the same bike. It's the neither one got inverted forks or a 19-inch rear wheel. The YZ490 even still had a drum brake in the back and an 18. That probably appealed to guys who just wanted it as a play bike or some desert machine, but it definitely pretty much made the bike completely outdated for motocross. I don't think many people were actually still racing them in motocross at this point. It was mainly like a play bike for people, like I said. So if it had been $1,000 cheaper than some of the other bikes, it might have been a pretty good buy. But considering it wasn't a whole lot cheaper, it was kind of hard to justify buying a 490 at the time. Overall, some good improvements for the 125 and 250, but the small bike and the big bike were kind of left behind that year. On pages 14 and 15, we have a look at the new Kawasaki's for 1989. The big news here was the last-minute switch back to conventional forks. Originally, the 89 Kawasaki's were supposed to come with upside-down forks. the pre-production units that had them. And actually in a lot of other markets other than America, they did have USD forks in '89. But at the last minute, Kawasaki USA had their misgivings about whether they had them properly sorted out and switched back to some 46 millimeter conventional forks, which were the kind that had been used by some of the factory team. Um, the Kawasaki's were probably better off that year for it. The forks that came on the '89 bikes were great, actually. They were a little bit larger than the 43 millimeters, so they had a little less flex, but were super plush and way better than the forks that Honda had that year when they went to USDs. The bikes themselves weren't much different. They made a lot of little tweaks to the engines and powertrains. But it didn't end up with it wasn't a major redesign. The major redesign for all the three of the big bikes had come in '88. It had all new bodywork that was strangely much wider and fatter than the '87 stuff. Actually, the Kawasaki's in '87 had been real thin. The tanks and the seating position was real narrow on the 500 and the 250, and then in '88 they went the opposite direction. I actually had an '89 KX250. I didn't really like the bike. I never could come to terms with it. I didn't care for the ergonomics and the way it felt, but I know a lot of people do like these. The 125 that year was also a dog. It was a real turd. Probably the best bike in the lineup was probably the 500. It was a really good bike. Smooth, easy to ride power, and for the most part, these were good bikes. So the '89 Kawasaki's, I think, were pretty good overall. Maybe not the best bikes of the year in most categories, but not bad machines by any count. All right, after the look at the Kawasaki lineup, we get a look at the '89 Hondas. And if you have watched my picks for the top looking Honda motocross models of all time, you'll know that I picked the '89 CRs as the best looking red motocrossers of all time. These were some really good looking motorcycles. In '88, Honda switched to the kind of a dark blood red look. In '89, it was their 250 was very similar, but the 500 and the 125 got that new body work, the new low boy look. Gorgeous machines. The 125 kept the right side up forks this year, still had the 43 millimeter forks, although because of some internal setting changes, it actually didn't work as well as it had in '88 and '87, but you could fix it. The stuff on the 500 and the 250, though, they came up with some 45 millimeter inverted forks that were just awful this year. They were terrible. They were harsh. When you landed off jumps, they had a metal to metal clank to them. They were just terrible. A buddy of mine had an '89 CR, and it was pretty tough to ride with those forks. I ended up having a '90 myself, and they weren't really much any better. But the bikes look great. The new bodywork, like I said, was much thinner, slim. It's funny, I just restored my '90 a couple years ago, and it's actually narrower than like a modern KTM. I had a 16 KTM at the same time, and the CR was narrower through the middle. These bikes were super thin. My another buddy of mine, the same guy who had that '89 250, still has the '89 500 he restored, and even if you ride it now, it's a pretty awesome motorcycle. So great looking bikes. Good year for Honda in most categories, but the forks were definitely not the hot setup this year. On the next page here to the right, we have a ad for MS Racing, which is Malcolm Smith's gear company. This was a ad that actually had a couple different versions. There was one as well with Rick Johnson and Jeff Ward, probably my favorite of these, but it's talking about what basically defines what they think is fun in the sport. This one features Mike Bell, who is the supercross champion in, I believe, 1980, if I remember right. He was known as Too Tall, had real long, lanky body, but he ended up having bad knees, probably due to those long legs, getting caught in ruts and stuff. Mike, after he retired, was quite a mountain bike racer and actually went to work for Oakley, if I remember right, and was kind of one of the big wigs at Oakley. Like I said, these were cool ads. I think we'd all sympathize with the things we love about the sport, and they kind of played on that thought. All right, on page 18, we have the last set of new models for 1989, and this one is for the new Suzukis. In '89, Suzuki was probably the most thoroughly revamped line of motocrossers of any of the big four. All three models were significantly updated. The most significant was probably the 125 and the 250, but the RM80 got a real important change that year as well. The bodywork on the 80 was the same, but the engine was new, and it incorporated a power valve for the first time. It had the automatic exhaust timing control, which was Suzuki's acronym for their power valve system, and it gave the RM80 a very, very broad power band for an 80. It had excellent torque, good mid-range, still had excellent top end. The Honda CR was probably as fast, or if not, maybe a little faster on top end, but it couldn't run with the Suzuki out of the hole. The Suzuki had by far the widest power band. And this gave the RM quite an advantage for a couple of years before some of the competitors started catching up. In the case of the 125 and the 250, both of them were completely redesigned. The 125 was new stem to stern, as was the 250. They both had brand new bodywork that was a quantum leap forward from the old body style, which looked pretty cobby in my opinion. The 88 RMs looked like they were, from 1983 that year. All the body work was kind of mismatched, didn't really fit right. It just looked really old school. And the bikes, the case of the 125 wasn't a great machine. The 250 was actually a pretty good bike in '88. Some people picked it as the best of the 250s, but the body work was a little old. For '89, the 250 was all new, and unfortunately wasn't as good a bike in a lot of ways. The 250 got the upside down forks that year. All new frame, suspension, everything, and it went to a case reed motor, which was didn't run as well as the 88. The 88 had a normal cylinder intake on the reed valve, and had a real broad power band. The 89 had a real narrow spread of power. The case reed motor, Suzuki actually used it from '89 until '95, and none of those bikes ran really great. They always had kind of narrow power bands that were punchy and hard hitting, but not very broad. The 125 this year, too, also had a kind of a narrow power band. It was real punchy off the line, but real choked off on top, and had a hard time running in the 125 class with bikes like the CR that had so much power. Over here to the right, we have an ad for Squeaky Sunshine Cycle. Don't know much about Sunshine Cycle. Don't know if they're still around. If so, good for them. All right, here on page 20, we have a photo of William Dieselak, who is from Connecticut, riding at Southwick that year in '88. The photo's by Paul Buckley, and it has, again, that kind of stylized artsy treatment I don't really like, but it's over there at the top there talking about the race events. William actually finished 16th at Southwick this year, and he had a couple of good runs. He was one of those fast local guys that would come out for Southwick and haul the mail. Below that is an ad for Tacky Grips D-Grip from Sunline. In the previous one I did for Motocross Action, I was talking about these grips, and these are the grips I swore by at the time. I loved them. They had a kind of a half waffle design, which was pretty innovative at the time. Back then, we used to take our Honda grips, and we would take a razor blade to them and take the waffle off the top so it wouldn't give you blisters. And Sunline came out with these D grips that did that for you. I also love the compound. They were like a thicker grip. I like the feel of them. They didn't give me hand cramps. The compound's really good. Didn't give me blisters. I love these grips. They were awesome. They were definitely the ones I ran the whole time until they kind of went away in the probably late '90s, I guess, probably when they went away. Here on the right, on page 21, you have the ubiquitous riders meeting where readers of the magazine write in their comments and questions. Some guys complaining about this dude Spike who was in a DG ad, and other people asking about the upcoming models. Nothing particularly interesting. All right, here in the Shreds section on page 22, we have a couple of random notes on some of the racing events at the time. Looks like at Redbud, some people were expecting Team Yamaha to show up with a liquid-cooled YZ 500. That didn't pan out. Brock Glover and Mickey Diamond, neither one of them showed up on the anticipated models. And Jeff Stanton was left to be the top Yamaha rider with a fifth on his production-based YZ 490. That liquid-cooled YZ, of course, never did appear here in the U.S. They did have them over in Europe, though, the YZ M500. Johnny O'Mara looks like he won a race in the 125 expert class at Mount Morris, Mammoth Mountain. And actually, interesting that this year, Johnny O'Mara would step down to the 125 class after the 250 Nationals were over, and that caused a fair amount of controversy at the time, with the former national champion moving down to what was perceived to be the 125 was a support class, more or less. Even at the national level at the time, a lot of people thought that was not right, but turns out he didn't do that well anyway on the underpowered RM. And then the bottom left, you have George Holland, who was the 88 125 national champion on a Honda, and his new wife, looks like her name is Dana, out on the town after the Meadowlands Supercross. Here on the right, we have an ad for North Shore Racing Honda. I actually Googled this and tried to do a little research to see if they're still around, just out of curiosity. And the address where this place was is a huge mansion that's quite nice, actually. So I'm thinking they're probably not still around. If you are still around, please let me know. But I didn't see anything other than some car dealerships, so I'm thinking probably not. Nothing too thrilling to report here on page 24 and 25. Some updates from the Nationals and over in the GPs as well. Mike Healy is reported to be not happy with his Cagiva ride that year. Healy had gotten kind of a support ride with Cagiva after winning the Golden States on the Italian machines. He would end up going to KTM the next year and actually have a pretty good run with KTM in the early 90s there, almost winning the 250 Grand Prix title in 91, if I remember right. But down there at the bottom, we have a picture of Jeff Stanton with model Chantal Dubé. Back in the late 80s when Super Motocross was still around, they used to do a little feature called Styling, or Style-In, actually, no G on the end. And they would have like a rider and a model or something in kind of an interesting pose. We'll get to it later in the issue. But beforehand, if you can see Stanton here, he wasn't exactly the most easygoing guy at the time. Certainly not Mr. Hollywood, more of a farm boy from Michigan. And they thought it was a good idea to have like a little lunch here to get them acquainted and maybe make it a little less stiff. On the right here, they have a talk about how the Nationals are going. RJ is dominating the Nationals outdoors. Guy Cooper is doing pretty well as well. In this year, he had a factory support ride from Honda and did pretty well as well in the 125s. At the bottom right here, we have a report that David Thorpe, after winning the British Grand Prix, crashed and broke his collarbone and dislocated his shoulder, effectively handing the title to Eric Geboers. Geboers, of course, are going to win this title. And Thorpe would get revenge, though, the next year in 89, but the 88 title was out of reach after this crash. On page 26, we have a couple of photos by Paul Buckley of Suzuki teammates Ronnie Tishner and Eric Kehoe running into each other. Apparently they got into it at the Meadowlands Supercross and then later that year at Southwick as well. Probably not a great idea to be taking out your teammate. On the lower right here, you also have rundown from some more information from the GPs. Rodney Smith, who was riding for Chesterfield Suzuki at the time, was currently ranked after 8 of 12 events, second in the World Championships. A lot of people know Rodney as a kind of an icon of the off-road industry, winning several GNCC titles in the late 90s and early 2000s. But before that, Rodney was a world-class motocross racer as well. And like I said, he came close to winning the 250 title this year. Below that, there's some interesting information that you think they might have put a little before this. It talks about David Thorpe winning the 500 Grand Prix and talking about how he had taken the points lead from Eric Geboers. But in the page before, they already told you that David hurt himself and was no longer in the points lead. So obviously there was some proofreading necessary here. On page 27 here, we have an ad for Dennis Kirk. I don't know if this phone number is still good, but I do know Dennis Kirks are still around. They are still a powerhouse in the aftermarket industry, and you can go to their website. Like I said, I used to have get their catalogs as well. It always kind of struck me that Dennis Kirk seemed like they were a little more expensive than Chaparral, so usually if I ordered stuff, I'd get it from Chaparral. But Dennis Kirk is kind of one of those iconic companies in the aftermarket motocross industry, and I'm glad to see they are still around. Here on page 28, we get some more race rundowns with the information that Jeff Ward wrapped up the 88 250 National Championship. This was a couple of years here in the late 80s where pretty much Rick Johnson and Jeff Ward were alternating titles. If Jeff won the Supercross, then Rick would win the outdoors, and if Rick won the outdoors, then Jeff would win the Supercross. Went that way for like 2 or 3 years. In the 500s, Jeff was leading the title after the first round, but then ended up suffering a flat at round 2, handing the points lead back to Rick. And in the abbreviated series, which was only a couple of rounds this year, that back then they would divide the 250s and 500s into half the series. It didn't take much but one DNF to cost you the title. At the bottom right, there's a product I do remember well from the late 80s was these Who's the He or Who's the decals. These were really cool. You could get your name and put it on your helmet or your bike or something. At the time when custom decals were kind of unheard of here in the late 80s, this was a cool product, and you saw everybody with their, picking these things up and putting their name on their bikes or their helmets or what have you. Here on the right, you have a picture of Brock Glover. This one is from the Tampa Supercross. First of all, I want to say I absolutely love this pink JT gear. This Brock's look this year was awesome. He's wearing that kind of Bad Bones jersey, those bright pink pants. It looked great, although it's kind of funny. The red probably shouldn't work with this pink, but it just looks good. The custom helmet, everything was awesome. This was a tough year for Brock. He was coming off a broken leg the year before. Had some pretty mediocre finishes. If I remember right, he ended up winning the last round at the Coliseum, but the rest of the year was pretty forgettable. And at the end of the year, he would end up getting dropped by Yamaha, which was pretty tough deal considering he stuck with Yamaha when Yamaha was terrible in the early 80s. He had offers to go to Honda and stuck with them in spite of the fact that their bikes were garbage. So it just goes to show you that loyalty is usually a one-way street in this industry, unfortunately. All right, starting on page 30, we have a really interesting article by Jack Bernicle, who was one of the GP contributors at the time to a lot of the American mags, on the Europeans and what they think about American racing. Here on the left, you have a picture of Kurt Nickel. His father was a GP competitor before him, Dave Nickel, who was really a fast guy in the 70s. And Kurt was known as one of the fastest Euros. He's from England. Kind of one of those bridesmaids, though. Was never able to win the title, but always right there, number 2. But this article kind of asks what they think of the American riders, and it's actually really interesting to read now. Guys like Dave Thorpe and stuff, they admit the fact that like Rick Johnson and Jeff Ward are like a notch ahead, but he says they're a notch ahead of all the other American riders too, and that they're not as far ahead of the European guys as the American press would have you believe. It's very similar to what we hear now. It's like I said, this is kind of an endless back and forth between American Europeans on who's better. But this article does kind of make the same points where the Americans would come over for an off-season race, a race that the Europeans weren't really into, and they would dominate it. And they said, well, guys like Rob Herring and some of the other guys are saying they weren't as into the racing. They weren't. Everything wasn't on the line like it is for the GPs. Kind of the same thing you hear now with our guys in the Motocross des Nations. How we come out and ride it, but you can tell guys like Eli and these other gentlemen. I don't think they're really wanting to put it all down, put it on the line like they were in the 80s. It's kind of a one-off race, not a whole lot on the line except pride, and it seems like only certain guys kind of take that seriously. And I think the same thing was happening in Europe, only reversed then, that the Americans would go and smoke everybody for a one-off race, and the Europeans would kind of cruise around. It's interesting to see. Like I said, a lot of the same comments you would see from people today are mirrored then. The guys like Jorgen Nielsen saying the Yanks are best at Supercross and we're best at motocross. I think obviously we'd say the same thing today. And guys like Pekka Vikinen saying, let's see them come over here and do a full Grand Prix season. Let us get them over here in the sand. You could say the same thing now. I mean, look at how Villapoto did a couple of years ago when he went over there. He struggled. Get our guys in one of these big crazy sand tracks like Lommel, and they struggle. It's really the same argument being made over and over and over. Makes for good bench racing, but I don't think we'll ever have a real answer. That shift of power is always happening back and forth. All right, here on pages 36 and 37, we have coverage of the U.S. Grand Prix for the 500 class at Hollister in California. This was a few years after the retirement of Carlsbad and what would probably be considered the heyday of the 500 U.S. GP. This year, there were only a couple of top Americans at the race. What's interesting is, I'm not sure if that's still the case, but back then you couldn't ride two different classes in the GPs, meaning back when our guys actually gave a crap about going, if you're going to have a 125, 250, and 500 Grand Prix in America, you had to choose which one you wanted to ride. So Rick Johnson rode the 250 class in '88 at Unadilla, so he was not eligible to ride the 500 class here at Hollister. So our top guy in that division for Honda was Jeff Leask, who was riding for American Honda at the time. Leask was from actually Australia, but he was American Honda's top rider at the event. Brock Glover was there on a hybrid YZ490 with a YZ250 chassis, still air cooled though. And then Kawasaki sent Jeff Ward and Ron Lachine. The Americans did real well in time qualifying, but then ended up having a rough day, crashing in the first turn. Both Ward and Lachine went down and ended up packing it in for the rest of the day. From there on out, it was pretty much a Euro show. Eric Geboers ended up taking the overall with a 3-2. David Thorpe won the first moto, but ended up with a fifth in the second moto. But by far the biggest news of the day was Leask, who I think a lot of people had their eyes opened on that year. Leask would run away with the second moto. You can see him here on the right, pulling out front on his Axo gear and beautiful Honda. Ran away with the second moto. Ended up getting himself a ride for the GPs that year in '89. In large part because of this ride at Hollister. He would go over and almost win the '89 500 title. Basically running out of gas in maybe the first round or second round actually kind of cost him, but Leask was really fast in '89 as well. Alright, starting on the next page, we have some coverage of the 1988 Southwick National by Fran Kuhn. There's a nice picture here of local hero Pat Botten, who was roosted his bike to a 5th overall that year. Southwick's always famous for locals hauling the mail, and 1988 was no different. Up at the upper right here, you also see Rick Johnson. He had an up and down day at Southwick in '88. He won the first moto going away, but ended up getting tangled up with Ron Lachine in the second moto, and he was only able to get back to 6th at the finish. Ron Lachine did a little better. In the second moto, he came back from that first turn crash to win the moto, but a 33rd in the first outing cost him the overall. That day, the overall would end up going to Jeff Ward with a 2-3, who would win it with superior consistency. Southwick's always one of those interesting tracks. Definitely, you see some kind of weird results for sure. On our next page, we have one of my favorite photographs that probably ever appeared in Super Motocross. This one is obviously from that Southwick National. It features 1988 Supercross champion Todd DeHoop leading fellow Suzuki rider Ron Tichner and the aforementioned William Dziliak. Again, I apologize if I'm killing your name, William. In any case, this was a great photograph. I love it. I ended up, like I said, putting it on. I pulled it out of the magazine and stuck it on my wall. Thankfully, I still had it here to scan. Great photograph. Those Suzukis weren't the best bikes, not the best looking bikes, but a cool photograph nonetheless. On the next page, we have another picture of Ronnie Tichner, also done by Fran Kuhn from Southwick. Don't love this one as much. Not a bad photograph, but doesn't quite have the coolness factor, in my opinion, that the previous one did. Last photograph from Southwick here is of Jeff Ward. This is another one I pulled out of the magazine and stuck on my wall. I was never really that big of a Jeff Ward fan. Didn't hate him, but I was an RJ guy. So anytime Jeff Ward won, it usually meant my guy didn't. So I was not psyched to see Wardy win the overall or do that well. Also, Ward just seemed like he didn't have as much personality. You know, I liked RJ's swagger and stuff at the time. I was young. Probably liked the whole image and stuff. And Ward just seemed like more of a quiet, working class guy. I think if I was older at the time, Ward probably would have appealed to me more. But back then, I thought RJ was the epitome of cool and just wasn't so much down with the Ward plan. Alright, here on pages 46 and 47, we have a rundown of the end of the 250 series. That championship would end up going to Jeff Ward at San Antonio, the last round of the 250s. He went 2-2 to RJ's 1-1, but Ward ended up winning the title based on a DNF that Johnson had at Axton at round 3, I believe. If memory serves me, RJ's water spigot came off the back of his cylinder back then. I think they were epoxied onto the back of the cylinders, and they had trouble with them coming off, and I think Lunas basically admitted that it was his fault for not taking extra precaution, but it came loose and caused RJ to DNF that moto, basically cost him the title. Like I said, the 250 and 500s were basically took the 125 series and cut them in half. So you had a limited amount of rounds. If you had a problem like that, it was hard to come back from it. The other thing that was of interest is Mike LaRocco ended up winning his first national moto at San Antonio in '88, and it's pretty amazing when you think that LaRocco was still winning, like 12, 13 years later. Amazing career for that guy for sure. Like I said, this year the 250s went to Ward, and then similarly the 500s, Ward would have that flat that would allow Johnson to win the 500s. So a little tit for tat there. All right, here on page 48 we have an ad for Sidewinder, which was one of the most popular sprocket and chain manufacturers in the 70s and 80s. As I said in the previous video I did with Motocross Action, it was actually owned by Vic Krause, who was the Mr. Know-It-All of Dirt Bike magazine fame. And they were well known for having really high quality sprockets and chains, kind of before companies like Rinthal and Pro Taper and some of these other companies kind of took up the mind share in that into the business. On page 48, we have one of my favorite types of articles in any of these magazines, which was a look at the works bikes. This one is looking at Rick Johnson's 1988 factory Honda CR250R. On pages 50 and 51, we have another photograph that I pulled out of the magazine and stuck on my bedroom wall back in the 80s, and that one is of RJ's 1988 Stadium Racer by Lynn McCready, who shot the photograph. Awesome looking bike. At the time, I didn't really love the 88's looks. Like I said, I was a huge fan of 87 and earlier bikes with the blue seat and the kind of orangey red color. It took a little while for the blood red look to grow on me. I also didn't really care for this CR logo, but now I love the looks of this bike. This one looks very similar to an 89 production Honda, basically because of the forks. In 88, the production CR was still using right side up 43 millimeter Shawa forks, but the factory bike used these 43 millimeter work Shawas. RJ had started using these as far back as 1986. In Anaheim, he raced in them, but early ones had a lot of issues with stiction, which is like a little bit of friction, I guess, like a drag in the fork itself between the seals and bushings and the sliders. And also there was a lot of problem with the feel that the forks transmitted. The great advantage of the upside down fork is it gives you a lot more rigidity to the front end. You don't get that flex. But they still had to figure out the kind of perfect blend between the strength of the clamps and the diameter of the fork and the way all that stuff interplays so it didn't transmit too much feedback back to the rider's hands. The early ones particularly, RJ complained about the fact that there was a lot of feedback. So he went back to the conventional forks for the remainder of the 86 season. In 87 he started running them full time, and then by 88 they were on all the time as well. A similar in appearance fork would make its way to the 89 Hondas, but it's actually a larger diameter fork to this. The stock 89 stuff was a 45 millimeter, and it was super harsh. So obviously they've played, all the manufacturers have played with the diameter of the forks over the years, trying to get the right mix of rigidity and feel. A couple other things that are different on RJ's bike. The porting was different, obviously. The basic engine was the same as the production machine. You couldn't make too many changes. The basic cases had to remain unchanged, but the bike did have works porting, works ignition. In 88, as he had done the previous 2 years, he kind of switched back and forth between running a Pro Circuit pipe and an HRC pipe. The Pro Circuit provided a better bottom end power, smoother transition, and he preferred that for supercross, but outdoors the HRC pipe had like a stronger pull on top. The power band was a little higher up, made it better, and he ran that always outside. The rear wheel was a 19-inch this year. Production bikes were still using 18s. In fact, Honda would run an 18 as a production machine, I think, until about 1995. They were the last ones to kind of switch over to it, but this far back, Honda was already running 19s on the works bikes. That you had a little bit of a trade-off there where you get, it was maybe a little more susceptible to flats, but gave it a superior feel. And if you did get a flat, the 19-inch was more likely to stay on the rim. So that was definitely something that you'd worry about having. You don't want to have a DNF because of the tire coming off the rim. This bike, according to the magazine here, is saying it's about $30,000 more than production Honda. You always hear some crazy claims about how much the full works versions, how much they cost back in the day, 100,000, 200, whatever. I don't know what the real number was. I don't think HRC ever said. But I'm sure this bike was significantly more expensive than a production bike would have been. Definitely a cool machine I wish I could take a ride on even to this day. Here on page 54 we have an ad for EVS knee braces. I have to think that CTI was probably a thing. I'm pretty sure it was. I think the earliest I saw ads for CTI knee braces was maybe about 1985 with that horrific ad where it shows a guy's leg getting folded the wrong direction. But I guess this was a much less expensive over-the-counter knee brace, kind of like what the Asterisk brace is now, or many others, obviously. Knee braces weren't as common back then as they are now. Kind of ironic when you think about how much more serious a knee injury was then. It wasn't like a real quick snip-snap arthroscopic surgery. It was a cut your whole leg open and you won't be able to walk for 6 months kind of deal. Definitely that's gotten better, and knee brace technology has gotten better. These catalogs here that you can order. I wish I could spend $6.95 and get this 220-page Malcolm Smith catalog. I would love to have one. I'm sure if I come across it on eBay, somebody's going to want me to pay him $100 for it. You can also get one of these Who's He catalogs and order your numbers. On the right, we have a couple of products that they tested. The Fox Kidney Belt. Always a big fan of the Fox stuff. These Fox Kidney Belts, man, everybody had them at the time. I still am puzzled as to why kidney belts went out of style. I ran them back in the day, and then, of course, I stopped like everybody else. Now I'm so darn fat that I probably wouldn't be able to fit it around my midsection. It would probably do a good job of keeping my belly in. But in any case, they kind of fell out of style. These Rai MX Pros. My best buddy Jamie always ran these things. I hated them. I always thought they were stupid looking. I'm not a big fan of that removable chin bar. Never felt like it was going to do much to protect you in the event that you did a face plant. It's almost like just a roost guard. If you ever use one of these helmets, there's not much to it. And I always figured if you really took a digger, it was just going to pop off. But plenty of people, including Jeff Stanton, ran them, so I guess they weren't too awful bad. Then we have a little video here for the Mini Olympics. I was never that fast. I never went to any of the amateur stuff, so I haven't been to the Mini Olympics. But I'm sure it'd be cool now to have that to look at. I'm sure there's a lot of famous riders that were in the Mini Olympics in 1987 and 88. Here on pages 56 and 57, we have some tips from some of the top riders and instructors of the day. On the left here, we have some tips from Brock Glover on how to turn your bike in the air over double jumps. This is one of those techniques that I spent countless hours trying to perfect. We'd find a nice steep jump, and then you try to be able to figure out how to whip the bike sideways. I never got to where I could do any crazy tricks or pancake the bike or anything like that, but it was always cool if you show your buddies how you kind of throw the bike out and stuff. Like I said, this is one of those tricks that everybody wanted to look just like RJ or Brock or something, to be able to do that themselves. I wish I'd been better at it, but I wasn't. You also have some tricks on using a little plastic dip on your levers. Never did that one either. How to turn your screwdriver into a magnetic screwdriver. Handy, but never bothered to do that either. On the right, you have Gary Bailey, who's David Bailey's stepdad, talking about how to practice turning. Now, this is something I also spent countless hours doing. We set up a little circle track in my front yard, and me and some buddies, we go around and I do like 1,000 turns, just turning and turning and turning. They'd say most races are won and lost in the corners, so that was always a good technique to practice on, and those circle tracks were always a fun way to do it. On page 58, we have an ad for the Torque Center, which I actually took a second to Google while I was reading this article initially, and it looks like they're still around. Looks like they're a bicycle shop now. I don't know if they still sell motorcycle parts, but there is a Torque Center at that address, and it's alive and well so far as I know, so good for them. There's a video here that actually I'd love to pick up. I don't remember this one. Pro Motocross Riding and Racing with Team Kawasaki. I have a huge VCR collection of tapes. I've tried to acquire every one I could. As you can see, a lot of them are uploaded up here on the Motocross Vault here on YouTube. at least the ones that I haven't been told to take down by Feld or somebody else. This one I don't have. I'd love to have a copy of it. So if anybody out there has it, hit me up on DM. I'd love to have a copy of it. On the right here on page 59, you have a test of O'Neill's chest protector, the Rock Block. Never cared for the looks of this one. Didn't have it myself. Always more of a Roost 2 fan or a JT V1000 2000 fan. The Rock Block always was kind of like a pretty funky looking version in my opinion. But I never rode with it, so it's hard to say. Below you have some up-and-coming racers. A lot of the guys I'm sure you've heard of. Brian Swink, who unfortunately passed away last year. Rest in peace, Brian. Troy Bradshaw. I don't remember Troy. He's obviously a vet at this point. He's 27. I don't think he's in relation to Damon. Gene Newmack, fast guy in the early 90s for sure. Wymus Scott, don't know him either. Chris Young, definitely knew him. And Pat Bodden, who was another one of those fast guys from up in New England. All right, here on page 61, we get the styling photo that I was talking about earlier. Like I said, Super Motocross did one of these in every issue, and it usually had a, well, every time it had a rider, both current or past, and usually with a model doing some kind of crazy pose here. We have Jeff Stanton with Chantel Dubé, or Dubai, I guess, with a, looks like to be a Porsche Speedster. Jeff's got a big smile on his face, which is funny because anytime you saw him back then, he was pretty sourpussed, very serious guy. I met him several times at the races back in the late 80s, and he was always, and early 90s, he was always kind of sour-tempered to me in the pits. But in any case, it's nice to see Jeff showing a little lighter side here. Jeff was sponsored by High Point. Never had any of this High Point gear, although I will say I would absolutely love to have some of these High Point Pro boots. These things are iconic, awesome boots, and I wish I could get a set up now. Definitely cool. Like I said, a cool photo. Maybe not my favorite of these styling photos, but it's nice to see Jeff show a little bit of a lighter side of himself. After the styling page, we get a very interesting interview with Belgian motocross hero Eric Geboers. Eric Geboers, unfortunately, is another gentleman that was taken from us last year in a tragic accident where I believe he was jumping in the water to try and save his dog and ended up drowning. Sad, terrible, terrible situation there, and gone far too soon. But at the time this interview was done, Eric was getting ready to capture the 1988 500 World Motocross title. And in doing so, he would be the first rider ever to complete the Triple Crown. The first rider to win the 125, 250, and 500 World title. Eric was at 5'6", kind of a small guy to ride the 500. A lot of people thought he would never be able to make the transition to the big motorcycles. Although he certainly proved, and other guys like Ricky Carmichael proved, that being short of stature was no great hindrance to going fast on a motorcycle. Eric was a guy who had really been one of the GP's top guys since the early 80s, and 81 was his first season in the Grand Prix, and then in 82 he had won the title in the 125 class, and then backed it up a few years later in the 250s. In the 500 class, probably his top competitors this year were Dave Thorpe, who was coming off a title, and of course the aforementioned Kurt Nickel. Dave had some problems that year, broke his collarbone, and Eric went in quite a run and definitely earned that title to capture that 1988 500 World Championship. There's some pretty interesting comments here. Eric goes on about the differences between the American riders and very similar stuff to what we had covered earlier. Although he does make one interesting comment talking about the way forward in Europe and the Grand Prix. He talks about how he thinks that the FIM is getting old, to quote Eric. Everything is still done the same way it was 20 years ago. The FIM should look at Giuseppe Luongo, who runs the show in Italy. He is an up-to-date organizer. Now, that's pretty funny when you think how Luongo has been in charge of the GP so many years now, and it's interesting that you see his name already here back in 1988 with Geboers talking about how he should take over the series. Geboers, if I remember right, he rode 2 more years, maybe. I think 90 was his last year. I'm a little shaky on that. I think 90 was his last year. He went out. He ended up winning this title, and then I think he won again in 90, and then retired on top. But Eric Geboers was a great champion. Went on to run his own motocross team years later after retiring, and his passing definitely was a huge loss for the sport. Starting here on page 69, we get an article by Lori Fontaines talking about how to make it in the big bucks motocross game. It's an article that's every bit as relevant today as it was in 1988. There is an never-ending search for sponsors in the sport. There was far less of it in the 80s than there is now in terms of outside sponsorship. You did have like Coors sponsoring the title, but you didn't have many independent teams at the time. Not a whole lot of outside sponsorship, but you still had guys, trying to scrape along and make a living. They're talking in the article here how Rick Johnson makes a heck of a living, but everybody else is basically racing for gas money, and that is exactly the same thing today. The only thing that's worse is now the bikes cost a lot more. In 1988, you could buy a motorcycle for $3,500, and then a two-stroke was much less expensive to modify and keep on the track. Today, the four strokes, you'd spend like 2 times, 3 times the cost of the motorcycle itself just getting the motor work done. So it's definitely hasn't gotten easier in that realm. Another interesting thing, they're talking about the purse money. In 1988, the purse money for a supercross had an average of $35,000 for the 250 class, which was the premier class at the time. Now that amount is around $67,000. So in 30 years, the purse has only doubled. If you consider what you could buy a house or a car or anything else, how much they've quadrupled, quintupled in price, it's pretty sad that the purse hasn't gone up any more than that. In this article, they talk about, like I said, how hard it is to get outside sponsors, how important that would be to subsidize some of the racing, how much money the teams spend. Now, obviously, you see a lot of companies coming on board with manufacturers support. Big teams like JGR and stuff having some outside sponsors, but then you see other entities like RCH Racing, which seemed so healthy a few years ago, folding. Basically, after winning a national title, they're gone a year later because you see companies like Jimmy John's and those casinos and stuff pull out. I don't think we're making it any easier for the sponsors even today to try and help out. There's so many restrictions on the kind of things you can do in the pits and what have you. I don't know that it's any better than it was then. The only thing one thing that has gotten a lot better is TV coverage, obviously. And in 1988, that was very limited. But as you can see, it hasn't really indicated a whole lot more to the riders. I mean, guys were making $1 million at the top tier back in the 80s, and yeah, maybe a guy like Ricky Carmichael or Chad Reed or some of these guys had made more, but these guys were doing pretty well then. The guys at the lower end, though, I think are struggling every bit as much today as they were then. It's one of these things that it's funny. The more you read these magazines, the more things change, the more they stay the same, I'm afraid. All right, we're once again entering the home stretch here at this little look back down memory lane. If you stayed with us this long, I appreciate it for sure. Here on the flight gear section, they highlight a few products back in '88. You have an interesting anti-snag device, which looks like some little cover that goes between the seat and the side panel on the '89 YZs. And the '88 for that matter. I know Damon Bradshaw and some of the factory Yamaha guys actually ran an '88 side panel, the old style side panel here on their works bikes because it extended a little farther and would keep their boot from snagging. This appears to be the same kind of thing, although I got to be honest, I never saw anybody running this. Looks like DGY offered it. The turbo boots, AXO turbo boots, these things are awesome boots. I had the Turbo RCs, which is the version after this. But I know a lot of people ran these boots. They're really highly regarded. That Kawasaki shirt at the top, I cannot endorse this. But I would definitely endorse the Fox kidney belt. The Strong Arm AccuTrack, what that did was, if you had some of these older bars, especially the ones with rubber mountings, the bars could twist in the clamps, and that would be a solid mount at the top and kind of clamp that down, make it more solid. Never liked these Sunline levers at the bottom. I always felt they felt kind of squared off and cheesy feeling. Never a big fan of those things. Here on page 78, you can get some back issues of Super Motocross. If you don't have them in your personal collection, I would recommend them. They're great magazines. Most of these you can find on eBay at this point. And you can also win some nice, hideous Hallman riding gear. Those gloves are just terrible. Look like you have scales or something on you. I'm not sure. I did have a set of the Viking pants. They were pretty good looking stuff. And like I said earlier, that I'm not a big fan of this Mach 5 chest protector. This is right before Hallman went to change the name to Thor. They were Hallman USA. Before that, Torsten Hallman Racing. Thor stands for Torsten Hallman Original Racewear, so it was kind of an acronym, and then that became lost over time. But this was right about the time, '89, when they transferred over from Hallman USA to Thor. Here on the right, you have Mike Fisher on his factory-supported Kawasaki. He was a support rider, a test rider in '89 and '88, and one of O'Neill's top-tier riders. Mike Fisher would later go on to be the team manager at Factory Kawasaki a couple, I don't know, mid-2000s or so, if I remember right, before being let go. And I don't know what he's doing now. You hear rumors about working at Costco, so I can't speak to what he's up to these days. All right, we've reached the end of another one of these classic magazine look backs. On the back cover here, we have an ad for City Boots, or CD. I'm not sure how it's said, to be honest. I always wanted a set of these. I thought they were cool. I loved the look of them with these little shock absorbers on the side that were kind of color coded to the rest of the boot. Thought they were a neat looking design. Never had them myself, like I said, but looked like pretty good stuff. And I think most people at the time thought they were pretty high quality stuff. I was an Axo person and I never had a pair of these, but definitely good looking. Larry Brooks is here, the guy in the middle. He was a national pro at the time, rode for Motocross Action as well. If you like this, I certainly look forward to doing some others. If there's a particular magazine or anything that you'd like to see me do, please let me know in the comments below. I'll see if I can make that happen. There's a huge, obviously, variety to choose from, different eras. I'm also considering doing like the some really old stuff. I have the first issue of Dirt Bike, most of them. I don't know how much I can add to that because I was only like 2 when it came out, but I think a lot of people would enjoy looking at some of those really old magazines as well. Like I said, I hope you enjoyed this. If you do, let me know in the comments below and we'll try and do some more. And I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Peace.